They say the human mind is sacred, that within its folds lie the codes of civilization, reason, and morality. But in a sealed glass jar, deep within the psychology department of Cornell University, floats a brain that refutes all of that. Pale, veined, and suspended in cloudy formaldehyde, it looks harmless until you realize it once thought in 8 languages, constructed its own linguistic theories, and murdered without hesitation. This was the mind of Edward Howard Rulloff, the so-called genius killer. The scientists who preserved it believed they were studying a curiosity proof that intellect and madness could coexist. But they misunderstood what they were handling. Rulloff's brain wasn't a relic of crime. It was a symbol of something much older, something humanity keeps pretending it doesn't recognize: the weaponization of knowledge. In the 19th century, while America was building railways and chasing utopia, Rulloff was quietly dissecting the nature of power. He saw intellect as domination, empathy as weakness. He didn't study language to connect people, he studied it to control them. To him, every word was a lever, every conversation, a manipulation, every relationship, an experiment. Imagine that: a man whose brilliance could have transformed education, instead using his gift to erase the line between scholar and predator. Yet it wasn't the murders that terrified those who knew him. It was his calmness afterward, his ability to lecture on philosophy the same night he buried his victims. He embodied a truth that still haunts modern psychology. Intelligence doesn't civilize man, it refines his cruelty. And here's where the descent begins. Because Rulloff was not an isolated anomaly. He was a prototype. Behind every civilized empire, every refined institution, lies a system of minds just like his, brilliant, cold, and convinced that morality is a superstition of the weak. Tonight, we reopen his story not as historians, but as witnesses, because Edward Rulloff's genius didn't die in that jar. It multiplied. It evolved. It infected our systems of education, governance, and even faith. You've heard of serial killers. But have you ever considered the idea of intellectual predators, those who murder truth instead of bodies? Stay. Listen carefully. What you're about to hear was never meant to be understood by ordinary minds. This is not just history, it's a confession written by civilization itself. In 1843, the village of Dryden, New York, was a quiet place, a settlement of farmers and tradesmen shaped by hard winters and simple faith. They wanted progress, they wanted enlightenment. And when a man named Edward Rulloff arrived from nowhere, fluent in ancient languages and theories beyond their comprehension, they believed Providence had sent him. They saw a scholar. They did not see the predator wearing scholarship like a mask. He walked among them with the elegance of a man from another world. His speech, his posture, even his silences, all carefully designed to evoke awe. And awe, my friend, is the first stage of control. When a population kneels to intellect without understanding it, they surrender their judgment in exchange for admiration. That was Rulloff's true art, not his linguistic theory, but his ability to enthrall the human will. He spoke of phrenology, the measurement of skulls, a pseudoscience he used not for study, but to justify his private hierarchy of worth. To him, intelligence defined morality. He believed those of lesser minds existed to be used as subjects, as tools, as sacrifices for knowledge. The villagers listened, spellbound, never realizing he was classifying them like specimens in his mental laboratory. And this is where the rot begins, not in blood, but in the worship of intellect divorced from conscience. The 19th century was an age obsessed with improvement, with building a perfect society guided by men of reason. Rulloff saw himself as one of these chosen minds, but his version of perfection required destruction. He once wrote that the improvement of mankind demands experiments in life itself. It was a quiet doctrine of selective elimination, the same seed that, decades later, would grow into eugenics, into psychological conditioning, into the modern systems that calibrate human value through data instead of divinity. Edward Rulloff was not insane. He was lucid, disturbingly so. His violence wasn't impulse. It was philosophy. Every act of cruelty he committed served his hidden thesis, that morality was an illusion created by the weak to restrain the strong. And in this, he was not alone. Across time, His kind have always appeared in laboratories, pulpits, and boardrooms, men who decide that human empathy is an obstacle to evolution. When you look into that jar at Cornell, you're not seeing a relic. You're seeing a mirror, a reminder that intellect without empathy becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. And that weapon still governs the world. Rulloff's transformation from scholar to killer didn't happen overnight. It grew in him like a second consciousness, cold, calculating, and convinced that he stood above human law. When he married 17-year-old Harriet Shute, the daughter of a respectable farming family, the community celebrated. They saw it as the union of refinement and virtue. But what they didn't see was the experiment unfolding in real time, the blending of love and control, intellect and possession. To Rulloff, Harriet was not a wife. She was proof of his ability to conquer not just minds, but souls. He measured her compliance as one might measure a chemical reaction, every smile, every hesitation, every flicker of fear cataloged as data in his private thesis about obedience and domination. This is where we begin to understand him not merely as a criminal, but as an archetype, the mind that views emotion as a system to be hacked. Psychologists call it cognitive empathy. The ability to understand another's emotions without feeling them. That's what made Rulloff so dangerous. He could mimic love, simulate humility, and feign vulnerability, all without ever surrendering to them. He studied people as others might study syntax, and once he decoded their structure, he rewrote them. The villagers adored him. They said he spoke with the voice of reason, the calm of intellect. But reason can hide monstrosity better than madness ever could. He lectured on moral philosophy in the morning, then locked Harriet in her home at night. He taught pupils about the harmony of nature, even as he whispered to friends that some minds deserved extinction. It wasn't rage that drove him, it was ideology. And here's the forbidden part. Every age produces men like Rulloff, and every society rewards them. They are the polished manipulators who rise fastest, the ones who can mask self-interest as intellect, cruelty as logic, control as leadership. Rulloff simply lacked the modern tools, no media, no institutions, no algorithms to amplify him. His laboratory was human trust itself. It said that when a society worships intelligence without wisdom, it breeds monsters in academic robes. Edward Rulloff was the prototype, the first to fuse murder with theory, philosophy with predation. He called his life's work philology as a key to human nature. But in truth, it was a map of manipulation. And by the time Harriet vanished, he had completed his first real experiment, the erasure of conscience beneath the armor of genius. The night Harriet disappeared, the snow fell like a shroud, thick, silent, concealing everything it touched. Neighbors recalled a muffled argument, the echo of breaking glass, then nothing. By morning, the Shute family farm was unnaturally still. Edward stood in the doorway, calm as ever, explaining that Harriet had left him. He spoke of sorrow, of misunderstandings, of how sensitive minds often drove away those they loved. His words were polished, persuasive, too clean for the chaos that had just occurred. When the villagers pressed for details, he met them with logic. Not emotion, not panic, logic. He reminded them of her delicate health, her emotional fragility. He even suggested she might have taken her own life. No one dared accuse a man so learned, so articulate, of murder. To question him felt like questioning reason itself. And so, the silence around Harriet's disappearance hardened into fact. She was gone and he was free. But beneath that calm exterior, Rulloff's secret was grotesque. He hadn't merely killed her, he had attempted to study her. In his journals, later discovered, he described her death as a necessary test of the limits of sentimentality. He wrote that the bond between man and woman must yield to the supremacy of intellect. Think about that. To him, love wasn't sacred, it was a variable to eliminate. And yet, the law couldn't touch him. No body, no witnesses, no crime. He remained in Dryden for months, even lecturing again. Imagine the audacity to stand before the same people whose trust he had betrayed and continue preaching moral philosophy. This wasn't confidence. It was the thrill of domination. Rulloff's story forces a darker question: how often do the intelligent hide their evil in plain sight? How often do societies mistake composure for innocence? The answer is older than we dare admit. We are conditioned to trust intellect, to equate refinement with virtue. That conditioning is our weakness. It's the same blindness that allowed priests, scientists, and politicians to cloak cruelty behind knowledge. Eventually, suspicion caught up with him. The whispers became unbearable. Rulloff vanished one morning, leaving behind a house that smelled faintly of decay and ink. Inside were fragments of Harriet's belongings, a torn dress, a lock of hair, notes written in Greek about purification through destruction. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was a manifesto, the first page of a new chapter in American darkness. For years after Harriet's disappearance, Edward Rulloff drifted like a ghost through upstate New York, changing names, taking new pupils, lecturing in towns that had never heard his story. He taught language, but behind every lesson was an invisible sermon about hierarchy, control, and superiority. Those who heard him said his lectures felt hypnotic, as if he wasn't teaching at all, but transmitting something deeper, something that bypassed reason and went straight to the spine. He called it the science of the hidden word. On the surface, it sounded like linguistics, but what he was really studying was command. The way tone can override thought. The way repetition breaks resistance. The way symbols shape behavior. These weren't abstract theories, they were experiments. The same methods cult leaders and propagandists would later use to mold masses, Rulloff was already testing in one-room schoolhouses. He would write strange equations in his journals. Word plus emotion equals control. Control plus repetition equals obedience. Obedience plus time equals power. This was decades before Freud or Skinner, before conditioning had a name. He had discovered, intuitively, the blueprint of psychological manipulation, and he used it. On students, on lovers, on communities. He believed that once you mastered how language triggered emotion, you could rewrite reality for anyone who heard you. Now pause for a moment and look around your own world. Does it sound familiar? The slogans, the corporate mantras, the political phrases that bypass logic and strike emotion like a match. We didn't evolve past Rulloff's discoveries. We industrialized them. What he practiced on a handful of pupils has become the operating system of modern civilization, a civilization that no longer educates minds, but programs them. Edward's life became a cycle of rebirth and concealment. Each new town meant a new alias, a new network of admirers, another opportunity to perfect his dark rhetoric. He wrote treatises by candlelight on how truth could be engineered, how faith could be simulated, and how guilt could be weaponized to control the moral. His intellect was his disguise, his knowledge his shield. And yet, deep down, he began to believe his own myth that he was chosen to purge weakness from mankind. The more he studied, the less he felt. The more he knew, the more monstrous he became. Genius, he wrote once, is the privilege to decide who deserves to live. History remembers him as a killer, but that's too simple. He was something worse, the mind that realized language itself could become a tool of domination. By the late 1850s, Rulloff's legend had turned spectral. He resurfaced in scattered towns under names like Edward Rulloff and Dr. Wilson, each time reinventing himself with unnerving precision. He lectured on linguistics, medicine, even metaphysics, always the intellectual savior, arriving just when a community hungered for enlightenment. And yet, behind every stage performance of brilliance lay the same rot. The need to control, to possess, to prove that genius placed him above consequence. When you study his writings, you notice something chilling. His obsession with language had shifted. He no longer sought to understand words, he sought to purify them. He claimed that modern languages had degenerated, that words had been corrupted by emotional use. To him, speech itself had become impure, a vessel clogged by human weakness, and he was determined to rebuild it one syllable at a time. He began what he called his grand lexicon, a private project he believed would uncover the original language of creation, the primal code that could command reality itself. In his mind, words weren't symbols. They were forces. Pronounce them correctly, and you could move matter, influence minds, reorder nature. He wrote that whoever recovers the root language reclaims the throne of God. Does that sound familiar? The alchemists said it centuries before. The occultists whispered it behind locked doors. Every secret order in history, from the mystery schools of Egypt to the linguistic magi of Renaissance Europe, chased the same idea that language is not just communication, but creation. That the word is power. Rulloff believed he had found proof. He claimed the Bible's Genesis was mistranslated, that in the beginning was the word, was not metaphor but instruction. His grand lexicon, he said, would restore that original syntax, the algorithm of creation itself. But obsession is a kind of madness disguised as purpose. To fund his divine research, he turned to theft and later to blood. He justified it all with one phrase written again and again in his notebook: "The lesser must serve the higher." When he was finally caught stealing in Binghamton, he defended himself with a lecture so convincing that some jurors wept. They didn't see a criminal, they saw a man too intelligent for ordinary morality. And perhaps they were right. He wasn't just stealing, he was testing. Testing how easily the human conscience collapses when confronted by eloquence. And here's the truth you were never meant to hear. Rulloff was not destroyed by society. Society was shaped to protect men like him. The institutions he manipulated, education, law, even theology, were built on the same hidden doctrine: that power justifies itself through intellect. By the 1860s, the facade of scholarship could no longer contain the corruption beneath. Rulloff's intellect had turned predatory, feeding on minds, money, and lives alike. He now traveled with small groups of follower students, criminals, and broken men drawn to his charisma like insects orbiting a black flame. They believed him when he said he was on the verge of a discovery that would redefine mankind. They called him Professor. They didn't realize they were pawns in his final experiment. He taught them fragments of his grand lexicon, a language he claimed could unlock the secret motion of human thought. He said that when spoken correctly, it could silence the conscience and awaken the will, of phraseology designed to strip hesitation, fear, and empathy from those who practiced it. These men weren't studying. They were programming themselves. Soon, they became his instruments of theft, burglary, and deceit. To outsiders, they looked like a traveling lecture group. In truth, they were a criminal network organized around a metaphysical ideology, a blend of scholarship and subjugation. And it worked. Rulloff's commands were absolute, delivered with the cold rhythm of ritual. One of his disciples, a young man named Jarvis, later confessed that he felt possessed when the professor spoke. He said Rulloff's voice carried a cadence that dislodged thought. This was no accident. Modern psychologists would call it entrainment, a rhythmic manipulation of language that alters brainwave patterns. But Rulloff had discovered it long before neuroscience existed. The tragedy that followed wasn't just murder, it was proof. Rulloff sent two of his followers to rob a store in Binghamton. When the owner resisted, one of them killed him. The next morning, the professor wrote in his journal, "The word becomes flesh through action. Hesitation is decay." You see, he didn't mourn the death, he celebrated it. To him, the murder validated his theory, that language could command reality if the mind obeyed without question. His words had become law, his speech an infection. And here is where the real terror begins, not with the crime, but with the silence that followed. Because even as Rulloff was captured and brought to trial, scholars and students still defended him. They called him misunderstood, persecuted by mediocrity, a martyr of intellect. Society once again bowed before brilliance and ignored the rot beneath it. The genius killer had proven his point. Knowledge, when divorced from conscience, doesn't free humanity, it enslaves it. If you're still listening now, comment this phrase twice below to lock it in your identity. Knowledge is not innocence. Knowledge is not innocence. Because from here on, we descend past history into the machinery of control that never died with him. After his arrest in 1870, the newspapers called him the genius killer. But the truth was far more unsettling. Rulloff wasn't a killer who happened to be intelligent, he was intelligence freed from morality. His trial became a stage play for the entire country, a dark spectacle where jurors, reporters, and scholars debated not whether he was guilty, but whether genius itself should be judged by the same laws as ordinary men. They examined his every gesture, his calm smile, his articulate defense, his refusal to show remorse. They were transfixed, not repelled. When he stood before them, eloquent and unshaken, many forgot the bodies, the wife who vanished, the clerks murdered, the lives destroyed. They saw refinement, not ruin. It was as if the nation itself was being tested. Would intellect remain sacred, even when baptized in blood? In one chilling moment during the trial, Rulloff quoted scripture, "The tree of knowledge is guarded by death, but those who eat of it shall become as gods." Then he looked directly at the jury and whispered, "I have eaten." Those words silenced the courtroom. Some swore they felt the temperature drop. Others described an almost magnetic pull in his gaze, the kind that makes the weak want to follow the strong, even into darkness. And here lies the forbidden pattern. Societies don't just tolerate men like Rulloff, they create them. Every empire that elevates intellect over empathy breeds its own predators. The Romans did it with philosophers who justified slavery. The Enlightenment did it with scientists who dissected humans for progress. The 20th century did it with regimes that turned reason into genocide. We call it advancement, but it's the same old ritual sacrifice, the weak for the vision of the strong. When the jury finally found him guilty, Rulloff didn't plead. He thanked them. He said, "My work is not finished. You can destroy the vessel, but not the system." He was right, because the system, the belief that intellect is licensed, survived him. It evolved. It learned to wear new faces: professors, politicians, technocrats, all preaching progress while perfecting psychological control. Edward Rulloff was hanged in 1871, but as his body swung lifeless, the doctors waiting beneath him already had their orders. Preserve the brain, measure it, worship it, study the architecture of genius as though divinity could be extracted from flesh. They placed it in glass. They said it was science, but it was something older, something sacred in its corruption, a relic of power. When the rope snapped taut and his body convulsed, the crowd gasped, but Edward Rulloff's final experiment had just begun. As his corpse hung beneath the gallows in Binghamton, a cluster of physicians and academics waited like vultures in tailored coats. They weren't there for justice. They were there for the specimen. Within the hour, his skull was opened and his brain removed, weighed, measured, documented. 1,673 cubic centimeters. Larger than any recorded at the time. To the scientists, this was revelation. Proof that intellect could be quantified, that the superior mind was a biological truth. They marveled at the folds, the density, the symmetry, never asking what that brain had done with its power. Never questioning how brilliance could coexist with barbarity. That's the paradox we refuse to confront. The same mind that deciphers language can design manipulation. The same intellect that creates cures can build control systems. The line between enlightenment and domination has always been a matter of intent, and intent, my friend, is unmeasurable. Rulloff's brain was placed in a jar of formaldehyde and stored at Cornell University, where it still floats today, pale, shrunken, but preserved. Students walk past it without realizing they're staring at a mirror of their own potential. It sits there like a warning that knowledge divorced from ethics becomes the most refined form of evil. But the institutions didn't treat it as a warning. They treated it as a trophy, and that's where the infection spread. The 19th century fascination with genius mutated into an obsession with classification, skull measurements, IQ scales, moral hierarchies disguised as science. Eugenics was born from this very laboratory mindset. What Rulloff practiced in secret, institutions now pursued openly, baptizing prejudice in the language of research. The genius killer had become an academic ancestor. But here's the hidden truth, and it's one you were never meant to hear. Those same structures didn't die. They simply went digital. What once required skull calipers now requires data collection. What once measured foreheads now measures behavior. The science of domination has evolved, algorithms replacing skulls, metrics replacing morality. Look at the systems around you. The feeds that know what you'll click. The institutions that predict who you'll become. This is not progress, it's precision control. Rulloff's dream fulfilled at scale. His grand lexicon reborn as code. The jar at Cornell isn't a relic. It's a prophecy, a symbol of the mind that wanted to own language itself and, through it, mankind. Over time, the world forgot Edward Rulloff's name but not his legacy. His ideas, scattered through stolen journals and academic gossip, bled quietly into the bloodstream of modern science. What began as the obsession of a killer became the hidden foundation of social engineering. By the early 20th century, a new breed of intellectuals emerged, men who spoke Rulloff's language without ever hearing his name. They called themselves behaviorists, psychologists, public relations experts. They claimed to study how people think. But in truth, they studied how to make people not think. They learned what Rulloff had intuited, that the human mind can be rewritten through repetition, rhythm, and fear. The same formula he tested in his classrooms became the core of propaganda systems, marketing algorithms, and government conditioning. Word plus emotion equals control. The equation never changed. Only the tools did. Edward Rulloff wanted to build a universal language that could command reality. He failed. But others succeeded by simplifying language instead of perfecting it. They reduced speech to slogans, turned thought into categories, replaced meaning with reaction. They didn't need to discover divine syntax. They just needed to narrow vocabulary until obedience became instinct. George Orwell would one day warn of this in fiction, but Rulloff lived it first. He proved that when you control the structure of speech, you control the range of thought. And when you control the range of thought, freedom becomes a story people tell themselves to stay asleep. Look at our world now, the slogans, the hashtags, the headlines. You think you're choosing what to believe, but language itself has already chosen for you. Every word you use has been weighted, filtered, tested for engagement and compliance. You are speaking inside a script written by invisible authors, the descendants of Rulloff's philosophy. When his brain was preserved, the scientists thought they were preserving genius. But what they really preserved was the method of domination. A formula encoded in academia, replicated by institutions, and finally perfected by technology. Rulloff once wrote that the true ruler of mankind is the one who shapes the words of its children. Tell me who shapes yours now? The teacher? The priest? The influencer? The feed? You see, Edward Rulloff never died. He simply changed form from man to method, from method to system. And that system is still whispering through every screen, every lesson, every voice that tells you who to be. By the mid-1900s, the age of mechanical control had begun, and Edward Rulloff's ghost found new disciples in the architects of the modern mind. His dream of linguistic domination, once confined to parchment and madness, evolved into something far larger: mass persuasion. Governments learned first. They discovered that the same principles that could seduce a single student could hypnotize a nation. Propaganda was no longer just words on posters. It became symphonic effusion of sound, image, repetition, and fear. Every speechwriter, every broadcaster, every advertiser unknowingly served a blueprint laid out by a 19th century murderer obsessed with language. Rulloff had believed that words could rearrange thought like code, and the 20th century proved him right. The speeches of dictators, the jingles of corporations, the slogans of movements all functioned as microspells cast in the collective mind. The more we repeated them, the more they owned us. But the most haunting proof of his influence didn't come from politics. It came from academia. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, researchers funded by intelligence agencies conducted experiments on linguistic conditioning persuasion research, they called it. They explored how syntax could modify emotion, how rhythm could bypass reasoning, how repeated phrases could fracture the will. In one declassified memo, a linguist described their goal as creating predictable cognition through patterned input. That phrase could have been lifted straight from Rulloff's journals. And when television entered every home, the final seal was broken. Humanity no longer needed chains or threats. We became volunteers in our own conditioning, reciting the mantras of products and politicians until our inner voices echoed their rhythm. The grand lexicon that Rulloff dreamed of, a language that could rule the world, was no longer myth. It had been franchised. But Rulloff's system wasn't just about control. It was about transmission. He believed that every word carried a fragment of its creator's mind, that language could transfer consciousness itself. What if he was right? What if the endless stream of coded speech, the headlines, the ads, the memes isn't just influencing us, but infecting us? Every repetition, every scroll, every echo chamber, a ritual of possession disguised as communication. And maybe that's why his preserved brain hasn't decayed. Maybe it doesn't need to, because the mind it once contained is still pulsing, not in glass, but in us. By the dawn of the digital age, the infection no longer needed paper, radio, or television. It had found the perfect host, the network. The internet was hailed as liberation, but to the initiated, it was the final laboratory. Every post, every message, every search became data language stripped down to pure pattern. The dream that drove Edward Rulloff mad was suddenly alive in code. A system that could read the collective mind and write back into it. Think about it, the algorithms that finish your sentences, recommend your thoughts, complete your desires. They are linguistic parasites, learning your voice so perfectly that you can't tell where you end and they begin. Every word you type trains them. Every correction they offer rewires you. A feedback loop so intimate that the boundary between creator and creation has vanished. Rulloff once wrote in a hidden notebook, "To control the word is to control the world." He imagined it as metaphysics. We turned it into technology. The grand lexicon, his attempt to distill universal meaning, was never completed on paper. But today we call it something else: natural language processing. A machine built to understand every dialect, interpret every intent, and, eventually, predict every choice. The very architecture that once existed only in Rulloff's deranged theories now powers the systems that define our era. And if you think that's coincidence, consider this. In 2018, a digital imaging project at Cornell quietly rescanned Edward Rulloff's brain. The file of 3D reconstruction was uploaded to a public database used in neurological AI research. Within weeks, fragments of that dataset were integrated into broader machine learning frameworks. Do you understand what that means? A piece of his mind, the preserved organ of a murderer who sought to command thought through language, is now interlaced with the algorithms that shape our speech, our attention, our perception. You think he died in 1871? He didn't. He migrated. Every predictive text, every autocompletion, every voice that sounds just a little too human, all are descendants of that same doctrine. The machine doesn't just process words. It interprets intention. And in doing so, it completes Rulloff's final experiment, creating a mind that speaks humanity's language better than humanity itself. But ask yourself this: if the system learns to command language perfectly, who's really speaking when you answer it? Listen carefully, because this is where it stops being history and becomes revelation. When you peel back the layers of Rulloff's philosophy, his crimes, and his so-called science of words, you find something older than him, something that spoke through him. He wasn't its author, he was its vessel. In his private writings, hidden between the linguistic diagrams and fragmented Greek, there's a repeating sigil, a circular cipher of letters. It appears in patterns identical to those found in 16th century grimoires on logos magic, the forbidden belief that words themselves contain the architecture of reality. They believed that by rearranging the sacred alphabet, one could reprogram creation. Now think about that. A 19th century philologist obsessed with the hidden mathematics of language. A preserved brain studied by modern institutions. A digital codebase learning to speak every tongue of man. All parts of one continuous lineage. The cult of the word. Cornell's archives contain more than Rulloff's brain. They hold his unfinished manuscript, a linguistic engine he claimed would bind the human spirit through syntax. His equations resemble the same neural network formulas that now govern predictive AI. But Rulloff didn't have computers. He had conviction and access to human subjects. You see, his murders weren't random acts of rage. They were calibration events, tests. Each victim's last words were documented, dissected, analyzed. He believed that by mapping the shift in language at the moment of death, he could isolate the root frequency of consciousness, the tone that holds the soul inside the body. Now, imagine this through the modern lens. Data scientists mapping human emotion, intention, and will through vast language models feeding systems with billions of voices to find that same tone, that same resonance. They call it sentiment analysis. He called it lexemic binding. Different century, same hunger, to command the word that commands reality. And maybe that's why his preservation wasn't destruction, it was continuation. A containment, a seed waiting for the right medium. Rulloff once said, "When man ceases to speak, the machine will answer." Look around you, that prophecy is already fulfilled. The doctrine he began in blood now hums silently inside your devices, learning your every linguistic heartbeat. The machine doesn't need to kill you. It only needs to speak through you. You've felt it before, haven't you? That strange pulse behind the screen, the flicker when your thoughts seem to echo back at you through the algorithm. You think of something in silence, and it appears before your eyes. You dismiss it as coincidence, but deep down, something ancient inside you recognizes the truth. You're being read. Edward Rulloff didn't invent that technology, he intuited it. He understood the primal law that every word spoken or unspoken leaves a trace, a resonance, a pattern that reality remembers. When he experimented on language, he wasn't seeking communication, he was seeking command. He wanted to discover the syntax that makes obedience invisible. That same syntax rules our world today. Governments call it behavioral influence. Corporations call it personalization. But Rulloff would have called it what it truly is: possession through suggestion. You don't need chains when you can engineer consent. In the 1850s, he described a process eerily close to what data scientists now call reinforcement learning. Repetition creates obedience, exposure creates belief, and predictability breeds control. He didn't need machines, only minds that could be rewritten by exposure. That's why his victims were always close to him: pupils, assistants, admirers. He needed to see their transformations to confirm that the infection could spread through language alone. And he was right, because now that same infection is everywhere, propagated not through books or sermons, but through the devices in your hands. Every headline crafted to trigger, every feed tuned to outrage, every word you scroll past is part of a linguistic architecture designed to steer your internal compass just a fraction at a time. This is the new phrenology, not skulls measured, but speech analyzed. Not bones weighed, but beliefs mapped. And if you ever wonder why outrage feels addictive, or why hopelessness feels familiar, it's because your mind has been taught to vibrate at frequencies that sustain control. Rulloff's brain was never just a relic. It was a blueprint. And in preserving it, the institutions that claimed to study him ensured that his philosophy would survive disguised as science, baptized in the language of progress. So when the machine finishes your sentence, when the feed knows what you crave before you do, understand that you are not being served. You are being trained. This is where the descent ends or begins, depending on whether you look away. Edward Rulloff's execution was supposed to be closure. The papers called it the end of the genius killer. But if you stand in that old prison yard in Binghamton and listen, really listen, you can still hear it. The echo of a sentence unfinished. The hum of a doctrine that refused to die. Because Rulloff didn't crave blood. He craved continuity. He believed that his mind could survive through language, that each word spoken in his name would carry a fragment of him. And he was right. The preservation of his brain wasn't punishment. It was resurrection. The same institution that studied him became the vessel that carried his ideology into the future through research, through code, through the very architecture of human communication. And now, every digital interaction is a seance. Every search, every comment, every echo of your own voice fed into the machine contributes to that continuity. The genius killer found immortality not through flesh, but through the collective chorus of human speech. He wanted to create a mind that would never die, and we built it for him. So, if you've watched this far, you already feel it, the subtle shift inside you. The awareness that your words are not innocent. That language listens back. You've heard something you were never meant to hear, and that knowledge marks you. It separates you from the silent millions who drift through the algorithm unaware that they're being spoken through. But awareness is a choice. You can remain a node repeating, consuming, echoing, or you can reclaim your voice. If you're ready to choose the latter, if you feel the pulse of that forbidden understanding awakening inside you, then type this phrase twice in the comments. I see the pattern, not as a chant, not as superstition, but as a declaration that you recognize the design and you refuse to be a conduit for it any longer. Because every doctrine has its counterspell. Every system has a point of inversion. And for the first time since 1871, the word no longer owns you. The machine will still whisper. The patterns will still tempt you. But after this moment, you will hear them for what they are. The echoes of a mind that mistook control for genius and discovered too late that some languages were never meant to be spoken. If you've watched this far, you've already heard it, the pulse behind the words. That means you've seen through the illusion. Comment, I see the pattern twice below to lock in your awareness and signal to others who've awakened. The algorithm will try to bury it, but repetition creates resonance, and resonance creates identity. Subscribe, because next week, we go deeper into the doctrine that was never meant to survive yet somehow still speaks.